Caleb Mercer was banking the forge fire for the evening when he heard his daughter's voice coming up the road, bright and unhurried the way it hadn't been in longer than he cared to count, and he looked up expecting to see her walking alone the way she always did. She wasn't alone. Elsie had someone's hand in hers, swinging it a little the way children do when they've decided, all on their own, that a person is worth holding on to, and it took Caleb a moment standing there with a hammer loose in his hand to understand who exactly his 8-year-old daughter had brought home from school. Miriam Hale looked older than the last time he'd seen her, though not in any way that troubled him. She looked steadier, maybe, the particular steadiness of a person who has carried more than her share of hard years and come through it without losing whatever had made her worth loving in the first place. Her hair was pinned the same practical way it always used to be, a few strands loose at her temple from the walk, and her eyes found his across the yard with an expression that told him she was every bit as unprepared for this moment as he was. The evening light was doing something soft and forgiving to the whole yard, catching the dust that Caleb's hammerwork had kicked up earlier and turning it faintly gold in the air between them, and for a moment neither of them moved, the two of them simply standing there taking the measure of everything the years had changed, and everything, apparently, they had not. "Papa," Elsie said, stopping at the edge of the yard with the easy confidence of a child who has no idea she's just upended her father's entire evening. "Miss Hale said she already knew your name." Neither Caleb nor Miriam said anything for a long moment. The forge fire ticked as it cooled behind him, and somewhere down the road a dog barked twice and went quiet, and Caleb stood there with a hammer in his hand and 11 years' worth of a name he'd stopped letting himself say out loud rising up in his chest all at once. "Miriam," he finally managed. "Caleb," she said, and her voice was careful in the particular way a person's voice gets careful when they've rehearsed 100 versions of a conversation and none of the rehearsals prepared them for how it actually feels once it's finally happening. Elsie looked between them with the frank curiosity of a child who understands, without yet understanding why, that something important is passing silently over her head. "You know each other?" she asked. "We grew up here together," Miriam said, kneeling slightly to meet the girl's eyes, her tone gentle and even. "A long time ago now." Elsie considered that with the particular seriousness she brought to most things since her mother died, weighing the information the way she weighed most new facts about the world, carefully and without much trust that things would turn out well. "Are you going to be my teacher for the whole year?" she asked. "Just this term," Miriam said. Through the winter, something in Caleb's chest tightened at that, though he couldn't have said, standing there in his own yard with the light going soft and gold behind the mountains, whether the tightening was relief or something considerably less comfortable than relief. To understand what brought Miriam Hale back to Willow Creek after all these years, you have to understand what happened between them a long while before either of them had any reason to think their paths would cross again. Caleb and Miriam had grown up on the same stretch of road outside Willow Creek, close enough in age and temperament that neither of them could remember a clear beginning to caring for the other, only a slow, steady certainty that had settled in sometime during their teenage years and simply never left. They had walked out together for 2 full years before Miriam's mother took sick with a wasting illness that kept her bedridden and needing constant care, and Miriam, the only daughter left at home, had done what a good daughter does. She had stayed. Those 2 years of courting had been unhurried and ordinary in the way good courtships often are. Long walks along the creek road, Sunday suppers at each other's family tables, the particular easy comfort of 2 people who had never needed to perform for each other because they'd known one another too long and too well to bother. Caleb had assumed, without ever quite saying so aloud, that they would marry once he'd built up enough of a trade to support a household, and Miriam had assumed the same, and neither of them had felt any particular urgency about it, believing, as young people sometimes believe, that they had all the time in the world to get around to the asking properly. There had been no dramatic parting, no forged word or cruel interference, only the plain, hard math of a family that needed her more than a courtship could wait for. She had written to Caleb faithfully for the first year, honest letters about her mother's slow decline and her own tired days, and Caleb had written back as often as the work allowed. But letters between 2 young people separated by circumstance have a way of growing thinner over time, not from any failure of feeling, but simply from the accumulating weight of two lives moving forward without each other in the room. By the third year, the letters had slowed to almost nothing, not from anger or betrayal, only from the particular exhaustion of two people each convinced the other had likely moved on, each too proud or too tired to ask directly. Miriam's mother died in the fourth year, and by then Miriam had taken a teaching position near where they'd been living to support herself, and the thread connecting her back to Willow Creek had grown thin enough that neither of them ever quite found the nerve to pick it back up. Caleb, in the years that followed, had married a woman named Ellen, a kind, practical woman from a ranching family 2 valleys over, and had built a good life with her, a real one, not a consolation. Ellen had given him Elsie, and had been, by every honest account, a fine wife and a devoted mother, and Caleb had loved her plainly and completely for the 6 years they had together before a fever took her 3 winters back. He had not thought of Miriam Hale often in those years, not because he'd stopped caring what became of her, but because a man building a marriage has no business keeping old doors propped open, and Caleb had always been a man who closed doors properly once he'd decided they needed closing. Since Ellen's death, he had raised Elsie alone, with help from neighbors and from Ellen's sister when she could spare the time, and had settled into the particular quiet of a household missing exactly one person and unlikely, he'd told himself more than once, to ever properly fill that space again. He worked the forge, he raised his daughter as best he knew how, and he had decided, somewhere in the hardest part of that first grieving year, that whatever capacity he'd once had for that kind of open, hopeful loving had likely gone into the ground with Ellen. Elsie had struggled in ways that worried him more than she ever let show directly. She rarely spoke about her mother, not because she didn't remember her, but because the remembering seemed to cost her something she wasn't yet able to spend without flinching, and she had grown, over 3 years, into a watchful, careful child who tested new people slowly, and trusted them even more slowly than that. Which was why it had startled Caleb so thoroughly, walking up the road that first afternoon holding Miriam's hand, easy and unguarded in a way she almost never was with someone she'd known less than a week. The Willow Creek schoolhouse, that autumn, was in worse condition than the county had properly reckoned with. The roof had been patched too many times without ever being fixed right. One wall had shifted enough on its foundation that the door no longer closed square, and the stove's chimney had a crack running most of its length that nobody had gotten around to addressing before winter came calling in earnest. The building had served the valley's children for nearly 2 decades by then, weathering harder winters than most structures its age had any business surviving, and the particular affection the town held for it existed in uneasy tension with the particular neglect it had suffered, the way a beloved but aging relative sometimes gets cared for more in sentiment than in practical upkeep. Reverend Cole had raised the matter at 3 separate town meetings before anyone found the funds and the will to properly address it, and even then the repairs had been approved grudgingly. The valley's families stretched thin by 2 lean seasons and disinclined to spend on anything that wasn't strictly, immediately necessary. Reverend Cole, who sat on the small committee overseeing the school's upkeep, came to Caleb's forge within the week to ask whether he'd take on the ironwork, the door hinges, the stove fittings, whatever needed a blacksmith's hand before the cold set in properly. Caleb agreed without much hesitation, the way he agreed to most practical requests from the town, and did not let himself examine too closely why the prospect of spending several weeks' worth of afternoons at the schoolhouse felt like something other than simple civic duty. Jonas Hartley, whose own timber stores were well stocked that year, sent over rough-cut lumber for the wall repairs without being asked twice, and Sarah Hartley spent 2 afternoons helping Miriam sort through a modest collection of donated books that the town's families had contributed, the schoolhouse's shelves having stood nearly bare for longer than anyone wanted to admit. Ruth Hartley, 11 now and already sharper with numbers than most grown men in the valley, took a quick liking to Elsie, and the 2 girls fell into the easy, uncomplicated friendship of children who have decided, without much deliberation, that they like each other. Caleb worked the schoolhouse most afternoons through October, mending hinges and fitting new iron bracing for the shifted wall, and Miriam taught through the mornings and often stayed on afterward, grading slates and preparing lessons at a desk near enough to hear the ring of his hammer through the thin walls. They fell, without either of them quite planning it, into a rhythm of small conversations that grew longer by careful degrees, the particular easy talk of two people who had once known each other completely and were relearning, slowly and without pressure, how much of that old understanding still held true. "You're patient with her," Miriam said one afternoon, watching through the schoolhouse window as Caleb knelt beside Elsie at the porch step, helping her sound out a word from her reading primer that had been giving her trouble all week. "Wasn't always," Caleb admitted, not looking up from the page. "First year after her mother passed, I didn't have the patience for much of anything. Learned it back slow. Same as anything worth having." Miriam watched them a moment longer. "She's a bright girl. Careful, though. Watches everything before she trusts it. Takes after her mother that way," Caleb said, and something in his voice when he said it was steady rather than pained, an observation offered plainly rather than a wound reopened, and Miriam noted the difference without saying so. Elsie's reading had been slow going since the school term began, not from any lack of intelligence, but from a particular stubborn resistance Caleb couldn't quite name, until the afternoon Miriam sat with her at the schoolhouse steps and discovered, tucked inside the girl's worn primer, a single pressed blue wildflower flattened thin as paper between two pages near the middle. "Where did this come from?" Miriam asked, lifting it carefully. Elsie shrugged. "It was already in there. Papa said it belonged to the book before it was mine." Miriam looked at the flower a long moment, recognizing it the way a person recognizes a voice from another room before they've fully placed it, and understood, with a small private ache, exactly which creek bank that particular blue wildflower had once grown along, and exactly whose hands had first pressed it flat between the pages of a book neither of them had thought about in years. They had picked wildflowers together more times than she could properly count during those 2 courting years. But she remembered this particular afternoon with unusual clarity, a warm June day the summer before her mother's illness changed everything. Caleb teasing her about her terrible aim skipping stones, while she gathered a small fistful of the same pale blue blooms that grew thick along that stretch of bank every early summer. She had pressed one into the book she'd been carrying that day, she remembered now, some borrowed novel she'd meant to return, and had entirely forgotten, in the years since, that the book in question had ever belonged to Caleb's family rather than her own. She said nothing about it to Elsie that afternoon, only helped the girl sound out the next difficult word, but she carried the flower's particular shade of blue with her through the rest of the day like a held breath she hadn't yet found reason to release. Caleb found out later that evening, when Elsie mentioned it over supper with the unbothered directness children bring to most things adults find complicated. "Miss Hale knew about the flower in my book," she said. She got quiet when she saw it. Caleb set down his fork slowly. He had given Elsie that old primer himself, a school book he'd kept on a shelf since his own childhood, never once thinking to check what might still be pressed between its pages after all these years. He did not sleep well that night, turning over the particular strangeness of a small flat flower managing to say, without a single word, everything he had spent 3 careful years telling himself he no longer needed to feel. The weeks that followed carried their own quiet weight. Miriam's teaching contract ran only through the winter term, an arrangement she had accepted, she told Reverend Cole plainly when he asked, because Willow Creek had needed someone on short notice and she had needed a position while she decided her own next direction. She had, waiting for her answer, a permanent offer from a larger school in Bozeman, considerably better paid and considerably more secure than a single uncertain term in a small mountain town. She had not told Caleb about the offer directly, though she suspected, from the careful way he sometimes went quiet after their easy afternoon conversations, that he had guessed at its existence even without the particulars. Caleb, for his part, found himself wanting to ask her to stay on past the winter term more evenings than he let himself admit, and found himself, each time the words rose up in him, swallowing them back down with the same old reasoning that had governed him since Ellen's death. Asking a woman to build a life around his daughter's needs and his own grief-shaped silence felt, to him, like a kind of selfishness he wasn't entitled to indulge, and so he said nothing, and told himself the saying nothing was a kind of respect rather than what it actually was, which was fear wearing a more comfortable name. Miriam read his silence exactly the way silence usually gets read by someone already braced for disappointment. She decided, somewhere in the cooling weeks of November, that Caleb valued her for what she offered Elsie, and nothing more permanent than that, and began, quietly and without announcing it to anyone, preparing herself to accept the Bozeman position once her Willow Creek term concluded. The schoolhouse's first proper cold-weather gathering came in early December, a modest evening event the families had planned to celebrate the repairs finally holding against the season, warm cider and a fire in the newly refitted stove, and the particular pleased relief of a community that had fixed something before it broke entirely, rather than after. The stove drew wrong from the very first hour, smoke curling back into the room instead of drawing properly up the chimney, and by the time anyone thought to investigate, a thin gray haze had already settled low across the room, stinging eyes and catching in throats faster than the modest crowd's first uncertain coughing suggested they understood. The room had been full that evening, nearly 30 families crowded warm and cheerful around cider and conversation, children weaving between the adults' legs in the particular chaotic joy of an evening event, and the haze had crept in slowly enough at first that several people mistook it for nothing more than the ordinary smell of a well-used stove, a mistake that cost precious minutes before the danger of it registered properly across the room. Caleb smelled it before he saw it properly, the particular acrid wrongness of smoke that has nowhere sanctioned to go, and moved immediately toward the door, calling for everyone to clear outside while Miriam, calm in the specific way a good teacher learns to be calm when a room full of children needs steadiness more than panic, began gathering the smallest ones toward the door in a controlled, unhurried line. It was in the confusion of that careful evacuation that Elsie slipped free of the group and ran back inside, small and quick enough that nobody caught her before the door swung shut behind her, gone after the reading primer she'd left on her desk. The one book in the world she was not prepared to lose to a fire she didn't yet understand wasn't actually a fire at all, only smoke and a stubborn chimney. Miriam saw her go and did not hesitate. She went back through the door after her before Caleb had even fully registered his daughter was missing, and by the time he did, shouting Elsie's name into a haze thick enough to sting his own eyes on the threshold, both of them were already inside. Miriam's hand closed firm around Elsie's arm, the primer clutched to the girl's chest. Caleb went in after them without a second thought, found them both 3 steps in, and half-carried, half-guided them back out into the cold, clean evening air, all 3 of them coughing and blinking and entirely, thoroughly safe. Elsie clung to Miriam's skirt once they were clear, shaking harder from the fright of it than from any actual harm done, and Miriam knelt right there in the frozen yard and held her without a word of scolding, only steady arms and a calm, low voice telling her she'd done a brave, foolish thing, and that it was over now and nobody was hurt. Caleb stood over both of them, his heart still hammering considerably harder than the danger itself had strictly warranted, and understood, watching Miriam hold his daughter in the cold, exactly how much he had been lying to himself about the difference between a woman being useful to his family and a woman becoming essential to it. The chimney was found, once the room cleared and cooled, to have a second crack higher up that nobody had caught in the earlier repairs, easily mended, no real danger beyond a frightened evening, and a great deal of unwanted smoke. But the fear of those few minutes stayed with all 3 of them considerably longer than the smoke itself did. Miriam's contract concluded 2 weeks later, the winter term properly finished, and she began with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has decided a thing and means to see it through cleanly, packing for the stagecoach that would carry her toward Bozeman and the permanent position waiting there. Elsie found her packing on the last evening, and without a word, slipped the old reading primer into the top of Miriam's traveling bag while Miriam's back was turned. Miriam did not discover it until the following morning, already seated in the small depot waiting room with her trunk beside her, and when she opened the bag to check her ticket, she found the primer resting there instead, and tucked inside its cover, in Elsie's careful, still-learning hand, a single sentence the girl had clearly labored over. "Home is where people come back for you." Miriam sat with that sentence a long while, the depot's wood stove ticking softly nearby, and had not yet decided what to do with the particular ache it had opened in her chest when the door swung open and Caleb Mercer walked in, hat in hand, looking like a man who had run at least part of the distance from his forge. "I wasn't going to do this," he said, a little out of breath. "The way I've been not doing it for 3 whole weeks. Turns out I'm not much good at continuing to not do it." Miriam set the primer down carefully in her lap. "Caleb, I confused grief with loyalty," he said, before she could finish whatever she'd been about to say. "Told myself loving you again would mean loving Ellen less, and that's not true, and I think some part of me knew it wasn't true the whole while I was telling myself otherwise. Elsie needs you, Miriam. That part I've known for weeks, but I need you too, for my own sake and not only hers, and I've been too much a coward to say that plainly until a stagecoach was about to take the choice away from me entirely." Miriam looked at him a long moment, the primer still open in her lap to the page where Elsie's careful handwriting sat waiting. "I thought you saw me as something useful," she said quietly. "Someone good for Elsie, not someone you wanted for yourself." "I was careless enough to let you think that," Caleb said. "Wasn't ever true. Not for one single afternoon of this whole term." He sat down on the bench beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and turned his hat over once in his hands the way a man does when he's run out of easy things to say and has only the hard, true things left. "I watched you go back into that smoke after her without a moment's hesitation," he said. "Didn't think, didn't calculate, just went. That's not a woman being useful to my family, Miriam. That's a woman who already belongs to it, whether either of us had gotten around to saying so plainly yet." The stagecoach whistle sounded outside, the particular ordinary sound of a schedule that did not care in the least what two people standing in a small depot decided about each other in the next few minutes. Miriam closed the primer gently and stood. "I have a position waiting in Bozeman," she said. "Better pay, more security than a small mountain school can offer." "I know," Caleb said. "Wouldn't ask you to give that up for nothing solid in return. Only asking you to consider whether Willow Creek might offer something that town can't." Miriam was quiet a moment, weighing it the careful way she weighed most things worth weighing properly. "The school committee did mention," she said slowly, "that they'd welcome me back for a second term, if I were willing to stay past the winter." "Would that suit you?" Caleb asked. "Not for Elsie's sake, for your own." "It might," Miriam said, and something in her voice loosened for the first time since she'd sat down in that waiting room, the tight, careful posture she'd carried since packing her trunk finally easing from her shoulders. "I'd want it to be for the right reasons, though, Caleb. Not simply because a girl wrote something true in the front of her reading book and neither of us had the heart to argue with it." "Wasn't planning to argue with it," Caleb said. "Planning to agree with it plainly, if you'll let me." They did not marry that spring, nor rush toward any promise larger than the one already quietly taking shape between them. Miriam accepted the second term and stayed on properly this time, in a rented room near the schoolhouse rather than any arrangement that asked more of either of them than they were ready to give honestly. Caleb courted her the plain, patient way he did most things, small acts and steady presence rather than any grand declaration beyond the one he'd already made at the depot. And the town of Willow Creek, having grown rather fond of both of them separately over the preceding months, took the whole slow unfolding of it with the particular warm patience small towns reserve for stories they've decided, collectively, they want to see through to a good ending. Reverend Cole, mentioning the matter from the pulpit only once and only in the gentlest general terms, remarked that some of the valley's best unions were the ones built slowly enough to trust rather than quickly enough to regret, and more than one member of the congregation understood exactly which two people he meant without his needing to say their names. Elsie kept the reading primer on her own shelf now, the pressed blue flower still tucked safely inside it, and had taken, that following spring, to walking to school each morning with her father's hand in one of hers and, more often than not these days, Miriam's in the other. On a bright morning some months later, Caleb walked his daughter to the schoolhouse steps the way he had most mornings that whole season, and found Miriam waiting in the doorway the way she nearly always was now, and Elsie let go of both their hands at the same moment and ran ahead up the steps without looking back, entirely certain, in the easy, unworried way of a child who has finally stopped waiting for people to leave, that both of them would still be there when the day's lessons were finished. Jonas Hartley passed by that same morning with a wagon load of lumber for another family's barn, Sarah beside him on the seat, and Ruth walking alongside chattering to Elsie through the schoolhouse fence, and the whole ordinary scene settled over Willow Creek the particular quiet way a good, hard-won thing settles once it has finally stopped needing to prove itself. Otis Reyes, sweeping the mercantile porch across the street as he did most mornings, paused to watch the small scene at the schoolhouse gate with the particular satisfaction of a man who has lived long enough in one town to recognize, without needing it explained to him, exactly what kind of ordinary morning he was witnessing. He had seen a great many things settle right in Willow Creek over the years, and he counted this quiet, unremarkable scene, a blacksmith and a schoolteacher, and a girl running up steps without looking back, among the ones that pleased him most. Caleb lingered a moment at the schoolhouse gate before turning back toward the forge, and Miriam caught his eye once across the yard, and neither of them needed to say anything more plain than what they'd already said in a depot waiting room some months before. Some loves, it turns out, do not need forged letters or public reckonings to be tested properly. Sometimes all it takes is a single pressed flower kept too long inside an old book, a child brave enough to write a true thing down before either grown-up managed the courage themselves, and two people finally willing to say plainly what silence had cost them far too long to keep guessing at. Willow Creek had seen its share of sudden, dramatic stories over the years, the kind neighbors told and retold at church suppers for a generation after. This was not one of those. It was a quieter thing entirely, built one patient afternoon at a time, and perhaps, for exactly that reason, all the more likely to last.